My name is Father Albert. I'm from a traditional Dominican community in Belgium, the Dominicans of the Holy Rosary. And I'm here at the Fatima Center to answer some of your questions. What does collegiality mean? Is it traditional? The normal scholastic way to deal with the definition of something is to start with the nominal definition, the word itself, collegiality. Collegiality is a new word, which is already a sign, a suspicious sign, because a new word suggests that perhaps it's a new doctrine, and in fact, it is, as we're going to see. The word collegiality was in fact invented by Yves Congar, the Dominican theologian, back in the 1950s. He takes it from a Russian word used by the Russian Orthodox, sobornost, which means literally conciliarity, I guess you would have to translate it. Sobor is the Russian word for council. So the idea for the Orthodox, when they talk about the sobornost, is it's the fact that for them, the ultimate authority in the church is the councils of the church. Because the Orthodox don't believe that it's the Pope who has all jurisdiction in the church, all authority in the church, but the bishops have the authority in the church, and the Pope has some sort of role of perhaps primacy of honor, and perhaps not all of them even accept that. But they certainly don't accept the Catholic doctrine defined at Vatican I, and which goes all the way back to the beginning of the church, that the Pope is the authority over all authorities, including the bishops in the church, that all authority ultimately resides in the Pope, that he has the tota plenitudo jurisdictionis, says Vatican I. He has the total plenitude of jurisdiction in the church, that he's really the head of the church, that he has the authority in the church over the whole church. The bishops, according to Catholic doctrine, have a certain authority over their diocese, and a real authority, but they don't have authority over the whole church by themselves. That belongs to the Pope. The Pope can invite the bishops to share in that authority at a council, an ecumenical council, and it's happened 20 times in the history of the church, where the Pope has invited the bishops to come together to decide some question of doctrine or practice, to ask for their collaboration in exercising his authority over the whole church, and even to make them share in that authority, because at the councils, the bishops sign the documents with the Pope, and so they as well participate in this authority over the whole church at an ecumenical council, but only at an ecumenical council, not in themselves. And it's the Pope who communicates to them this authority by inviting them to the council. They don't have it in themselves. It comes to them from the Pope. This is a traditional teaching in the church. So when Yves Congar uses this word to define what collegiality means, it's already a sign of a doctrine that's not traditional in the church. The councils of the church have their authority from the Pope and not from the bishops themselves. So using this word collegiality, meaning conciliarity, as if the authority in the church comes from the councils of the bishops together, as strictly speaking, it's a heresy, as Yves Congar knows perfectly well. That's why he didn't want to translate this Russian word as conciliarity or conciliarism, because that has already been condemned. There was a council, a false council, in the 15th century, the Council of Basel, and also the Council of Constance in part, which tried to define this as a doctrine of the church, that it's not the Pope, but the bishops united in a council that have authority in the church. And later that was condemned by the church, and solemnly condemned by Vatican I in the 19th century. So Yves Congar is smart enough to know that he couldn't use that word, conciliarism, but collegiality is simply a very similar idea, although I'll explain to you precisely what they mean by it, Yves Congar and company. For them, they say, we're not denying Vatican I. The Pope does have all authority in the church. He can act alone in the church. But the bishops also have authority over the whole church with the Pope. So the Pope can act alone, but he doesn't have the monopoly on the universal authority in the church. The bishops also, according to this doctrine, by the very fact that they are consecrated bishops, share in the authority that the Pope has over the whole church. That's why he uses the word collegiality, because by their consecration, according to this doctrine, bishops belong to the college of all bishops, and because by the very fact, then, of belonging to the college, they share in authority not only over their diocese, but over the whole church. Cardinal, well, at the time it wasn't Cardinal, Father Ratzinger, in a book that he wrote together with Karl Rahner, just before the council began in 1960, I believe, he quotes a theologian as describing the difference between Vatican I's idea of what the authority in the church is like, and this new idea that for Vatican I, the church is like a circle and the Pope is at the center. But according to this other idea, collegiality, the church is like an ellipse, which has two centers. One is the Pope, and the other is the bishops together with the Pope. So the church is not a circle with a Pope at the center, but an ellipse which has two centers. Now, when people object to them, well, then you're going to have chaos, because if you have two centers, two heads in any society, well, there's going to be chaos. But they responded, well, that's true. In a normal human, natural society, that would be the case. But the church is supernatural, and the Holy Ghost will take care of it. This is their answer. And you see this answer coming up over and over again when people object to this doctrine, that it's going to destroy the church because any society that has two heads is going to be destroyed. Well, they respond simply, well, that would happen, yes, in a natural society, but it's not going to happen here because the Holy Ghost is going to intervene. What should we think of this doctrine? Is it traditional? They say, the collegiality, the people who hold this doctrine, say that for the first 1,000 years in the church, that's the way it worked. Bishops were considered to have authority by the very fact of being consecrated bishops, and that this authority gave them a share in the jurisdiction over the whole church. And they say it's only in the Middle Ages that you started to see bishops who did not have authority by their very consecration. Those what are called titular bishops. That is, a bishop who is consecrated a bishop, but does not have a diocese. He has no authority over a certain region. And it's true that only started to happen in the Middle Ages. And so they say, for the first 1,000 years, this is what the doctrine was, that bishops received their authority by their consecration. And then it's only in the Middle Ages that this changed. Now, it's true, in the first 1,000 years, there was no division made between the sacramental powers of a bishop, that is, what he can do on the level of sacraments, that is, in particular, ordain priests, and his jurisdictional powers by which he governs and teaches the faithful. For 1,000 years, there was no distinction made between the two. Afterwards, though, there was, and the church decided that you could distinguish these two aspects of being a bishop, that you can be a bishop sacramentally, have the power to consecrate other bishops and to ordain priests, and not have jurisdiction. So the question really comes down to, was the church mistaken in thinking that? Because when the people who hold collegiality say that we have to go by what was done in the first 1,000 years of the church, and that what happened afterwards is wrong. But this would imply that for 1,000 years now, the church has been mistaken about what it means to be a bishop. That's the real problem with collegiality, is precisely it's against Catholic tradition. That is, 1,000 years of the church has considered that there is a difference between the sacramental powers of a bishop and the jurisdiction, that the sacrament of being a bishop does not give authority in the church. So we have to choose between saying the church was wrong for 1,000 years, or we can simply say, after 1,000 years, the church understood that, in fact, what was together for the first 1,000 years, the sacramental power of bishops and their jurisdiction, can, in fact, be separated. And so, the very fact of being consecrated bishop does not give you jurisdiction in the church. That comes from the Pope. And this is what was taught for 1,000 years, that bishops receive their authority, even in their diocese, from the Pope. Now, that was discussed at the Council of Trent, that precise point. Do bishops receive their authority in their diocese from the Pope immediately, or does it come directly from God when they are consecrated bishops and assign and receive their diocese? And the Council of Trent decided we're not going to decide this question. But no one, or hardly anyone, ever imagined that the bishops received authority over the whole church by the simple fact of being consecrated bishops. There were some theologians who proposed this doctrine, but they were in a very small minority, and they were refuted by the great majority of Catholic theologians, especially in the last 500 years, after the Council of Trent. Now, what happened at Vatican II is these theologians who were in the great minority were appealed to as authorities, and in fact, the doctrine which Vatican II proposes comes from these theologians who were in the great minority for hundreds of years. And now all of a sudden, at the council, they are given their doctrine, which was much less common before 1960, has suddenly become the official teaching of the Church. So to say that collegiality is traditional is simply not true. It's a new doctrine which came out of nowhere just before the Council and took over the Catholic Church during the Second Vatican Council. Now, I can't go into detail about it right now. I gave a whole conference on it that you can find at Angelus Press. It was an Angelus conference in 2012, which was on the papacy, and I gave a whole talk on this question of collegiality at the Council. To put it briefly, it was no doubt the most important question which was discussed at the Council was this question of the authority of the bishops and of the Pope over the whole Church, the relation between the two. It was a great battle, and it was a draw. There was no real conclusion. The traditional bishops were managed to appeal to the Pope at the last minute and get him to intervene to avoid that the collegial doctrine be promulgated clearly. But the final result is not clear. What is the relationship between the authority that the Pope has over the whole Church and the authority that the bishops have? The question remains open and disputed. If you study carefully the Council, I don't think you can deny that they came down on the side of a moderate collegiality, because there's three positions. The first position is the traditional position up until the Council, which was all authority over the universal Church comes from the Pope. If the bishops have it, it's because they receive it from the Pope during a council. If they don't have it outside of a council. In the Council, they have it from the Pope. The other position, the other extreme, if you like, is the position of collegiality, strictly speaking, which is that it's the College of Bishops who has authority over the whole Church. And the Pope, because he's the head of the college, has authority over the whole Church. They don't deny that it's the Pope who has this authority over the whole Church, but the problem is they say he shares this authority with the bishops, even though the bishops have a certain submission that they must have towards the Pope because he's the head of the college. As bishops, they share with him in this authority over the whole Church by their very consecration. Now, the real problem with that doctrine is, as I said, it seems very clearly to contradict Vatican I, which said explicitly that the Pope has the whole plenitude of jurisdiction in the Church. So if he has the whole plenitude of jurisdiction in the Church, how can you say that the bishops have it by themselves, by their consecration? And that's a question that they have never been able to answer. However, the final result of the Council, the position taken by the Council, it seems clear, was the third possible position, which is sort of a middle ground between the two of them, which says, yes, the Pope has authority over the whole Council by himself, but he also has authority over the Council with the bishops. So you have two supreme authorities in the Church. One is the Pope alone, and the other is the Pope with the bishops. Now, they try to resolve this problem by saying that there's only an inadequate distinction between the Pope alone and the Pope with the bishops, because the Pope is in the College of Bishops. But the problem is, again, if the bishops don't receive this authority from the Pope, then there is a dichotomy. There is a conflict. And it is causing the destruction of the Church. this problem of having two heads in one society is a problem. It does lead to destruction, and it is leading to the destruction of the church. We have seen Paul VI himself, who took this middle position, had to pay for it afterwards, in particular with the question of when he condemned contraception, and whole Episcopal conferences said they didn't agree with him. He had cut out from under his own feet the branch he was standing on, having undermined his own authority. He could not really make the bishops get back into line, because he had given them a certain authority independently from himself. And we've seen ever since then it's the same thing. Even when Rome tries to impose something on the bishops, they just say no. Especially, for example, the German bishops, they've often said this, we don't take our orders from Rome. Well, that comes from collegiality. There's no question about that. And it's no doubt the crux of the problem that we're having in the church for these last 50 years, because it's a way of democratizing the church. And the church is not democratic. It's monarchical. And they simply don't believe that the church is monarchical. In the discussions that took place between the theologians of the Society of St. Pius X with the theologians of the Vatican some years ago about the different questions that have come up since the Council, when they discussed this problem of collegiality, the theologians of the Vatican laughed when the idea was presented of authority in the church being monarchical. For them, that's just utterly ridiculous. And yet, that's what everybody taught before 1960. So, it is a question that's very important, and that must be resolved if we're ever going to come back to normality in the church. I hope that answers your question. Pray to Our Lady to enlighten you, to help you. May God bless you.